Hey everybody, this is George from FFM Music, and in today's episode of FFM Music Soundtrack podcast, we have Jeff Rona, who's an amazing composer who is one of the people responsible for us nowadays being able to use MIDI. Hi Jeff, welcome. I'm honored that you're here today.
Well, George, I am so thrilled as well as you know, you and I met by accident many years ago when you were really one of the very first people ambitious enough to sample a real orchestra playing orchestral music in a way that nobody had done before, nobody had thought of. And I was so impressed, and I'm so glad that we've maintained a friendship and a working relationship. And you've been very inspiring to me over the years.
Oh, thank you. This means a lot. And I remember that we met in person in on the NAMM show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my recollection.
Yes. And there you actually told me something that was quite astonishing for me, that you actually have a connection with Bulgaria.
Well, yeah, when I was a student and I really didn't do very well in university. My college, and I ended up dropping out. I attempted to be an art major and later a music major to study and get a degree, and I just wasn't cut out for this. But I was very fortunate to have two teachers privately, who I just studied with on my own. And one of them was a Bulgarian pianist named Milcho Leviev, who just passed away last year or year before. And he was very active in the LA jazz scene. I'm here in Los Angeles. He was very active. I'd heard of him because he was the keyboard player for one of my musical heroes, Don Ellis, who was this sort of avant-garde jazz trumpet player who was taking so many chances. And I was so blown away by somebody taking the form of big band jazz and adding an electric string quartet and quarter tone trumpets and a French horn section. And then Indian ragas became a big part of it, and Turkish music and other forms of Eastern music. And then this Milcho guy shows up and blows everybody away with a style of music and performance that I was transfixed. And when I got a chance to meet him, I was so thrilled. And he said to me, "Look, I know you don't have any money, but here's my proposition to you. I have a big Fender Rhodes suitcase. That's the one with the speaker in it.
Yeah.
And I need somebody who'll bring it to all my jazz gigs at all these clubs. If you'll take it and pick it up and keep it at your house, I'll give you lessons." So it destroyed the back of my car. Completely, the seats were shredded, just completely gone by the time I was done with him. But for the next couple of years, Milcho became my teacher. And it wasn't just about his amazing knowledge of Bulgarian meter and rhythm and harmony.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even about his deep knowledge of jazz rhythm and harmony and melody. What Milcho taught me was a level of open-mindedness that none of the teachers at my university would even begin to touch. At the university, it's like, well, there are no rules, but you did it wrong.
Yeah.
Well, what did I do wrong? Well, you didn't pay attention to Stockhausen or Stravinsky, very, very classical explanations. But with Milcho was like, well, there aren't any wrong notes, but what was your intent? He only wanted to know that what I was doing had purpose. And after that, nothing else mattered. So what I learned from him was open-mindedness, but at the same time, a discipline of having a reason for everything. Even if it just came off your fingers in real time, it didn't matter. Everything had to have a purpose, but after that, anything goes. And, that's a very Miles Davis approach.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to look at life. Everything about what he said made sense to me in life, that it's not about getting it right. It's about trying your best to have intent with everything you do.
And do you still use this approach when you're writing music?
Of course.
Yes.
What else can you do?
Yeah.
You know, I think that composing music is not a series of accidents, although thank God for those. I think composing music or writing, creating, is a series of very, very rapid decisions that you make without thinking. And you bring everything you know to every decision, but you don't think about the decision. You just say, A flat. I'm committed to A flat because it just I don't know why, but it feels right, and it's taking me to E flat, and that's all I want to do. Later, you can step out of the creative role and become the critical role, become the critic, to say, well, was A flat the best approach? Well, you know, there's something cool about D flat. So I believe strongly that being creative is a form of very rapid decision making without questioning, without judging, having no judgment. And Milcho had no judgment. You know, all my teachers that were good teachers had no judgment. But then they would say, okay, now that you've gotten it, you've written it down, you have a little time now, think it through. So it's that 2-layer process. I later worked with this trumpet player named John Hassel, and worked with him and worked with Brian Eno. And there was this idea of learning to be a filter. You know, Brian Eno would often, when somebody said, well, what is it that you do as a producer? He said, I'm a filter. And that's a great way to look at it. It's one thing to be the filter for somebody else, and it's a little harder, I think, to be the filter for yourself. Don't you agree?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because then you have to know your strengths and also your weaknesses.
Yeah, well, it's very hard, which is not easy to do, because when you start thinking about your weaknesses, then you start questioning everything, because who knows if A flat comes from a strength or a weakness. and the same with the second decision and the fifth decision, and well, up to the 11th decision, I guess. And so this idea of having the confidence to create without thinking about these judgments, and I think you have to be creative and then be the filter. I think if you try to do them at the same time, you slow down. And when you slow down, you start to make more mistakes. And I'm not saying it's important to be reckless. I'm thinking that it's important not to question your process of creation until you're done. You know, until you get to the end of bar 16. And then you can be the filter. Or in many cases, I go to friends and colleagues and I'll say, you know, I wrote this thing. I kind of like it, but I'm not 100% sure. What do you think? And very often I get this opportunity I surround myself with filters.
And when you work, because you have tons of films in your portfolio, and you've been working in LA for quite some time, and when you have a very stressful deadline for a movie, for example, how do you cope with this, the creative side of it and being a filter? Do you have the time to be a filter actually, or
You know, to me, not having the deadline is terrifying. Having a deadline is like, well, at least I know when I'll be done. There's one decision. Now let's figure out what's for dinner.
I hear you.
You know, it's interesting. I think you ask a very important question, which is the role of stress in not being creative, but being a creative person on a job where somebody's paying you to finish. You know, they don't pay you to compose; they pay you to finish.
That's right. Yeah.
And I apply the same level of care that I'm allowed to. And time is sometimes the enemy, but usually it's not. Deadlines have always been unreasonable. I think going back to the dawn of the movie industry, 100 years ago, composers were always put under pressure. And I think it's important to remember that every beautiful score you've ever heard in your life, whether it's John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith or Korngold or any of the Newmans or the Zimmers or the, you name it, were all written under the worst possible circumstances. and yet, look at the scores we have.
Yeah, they prevailed somehow.
And somehow they prevail.
Yeah.
Well, how? Well, you practice. And you surround yourself with support, orchestration, soloists, engineers, arrangers, whatever it is. You surround yourself with competent, trustworthy people so that you yourself can be competent and trustworthy. But every note we've ever heard comes from multiple cues rejected, from the clock ticking, from delays and re-edits and last-minute fixes that ruin great pieces of phrasing. Actually, when I shared a studio for many years with Hans Zimmer, we kind of had this philosophy, which is death is not an excuse.
Yeah.
and that's a good one, the idea that there are no excuses, none whatsoever. And I'll be honest, George, I've never really thought about it. When I think back in my career, the early days were struggles because I couldn't write as fast. As I got more experience, I learned how to write simpler with the same emotional result, I think. And I don't know about you, when I think about my favorite music, I'm always struck by the simplicity of it, not the complexity of it. And if you look at the great film writers, I think all of them, they embrace a level of simplicity 80% of the time or 90% of the time. Yeah. And that is to say, every so often there's a cue that comes in and it's a tour de force. It's just extravagant and beautiful and amazing. And then once things start going, it comes back down and you allow simplicity to be your greatest ally. Number one, you can write more quickly. Number two, it's better for the project. And number three, getting into the territory where you and I connect, it's easier to record. You can get more music recorded if you're not showing off. So I know many composers who write very ornate, articulate music and very sophisticated orchestrations with a lot of nuance and a lot of ornamentation. That all sounds great, but there's a point where it doesn't actually add anything to the end result in many cases. And that's just me. I often, and I don't know about you, George, but often the last step that I do in quote unquote finishing a piece of music, if there's such a thing as finishing a piece of music, is asking myself, what can I take out? What can I remove from this piece of music and not lose what's at the core of what this music is trying to achieve dramatically?
To do, yeah.
And the answer is usually more than you think. And I'll sit in front of my screen and I just start muting things. I just start muting regions. And I listen and I'll go, is it still okay? Sure is. Let's go a little further. I think that's a level of I don't want to say that makes me brave, but I think for a lot of composers, there's sort of a terror in that kind of minimalism of thought. But the fact is I think you can look at most all film and TV and video game music, all music for picture, and say what do all the great pieces have in common? And more often than not, it's simplicity, it's directness, it's leaving out all the parts that don't add to it. Bernard Herrmann is certainly one of my heroes. Although in reading this biography of him, I'm glad we never met. But yeah, you know what they say, you're never supposed to meet your heroes. I've met a few of my heroes, and it's actually mostly been really positive. Yeah. But, Bernard Herrmann, I think, was the first composer, successful composer, to step out of that neoclassical or neo-romantic view of music for cinema, and opened the door for what I think is still the more modern era of film music, of being able to sit on an ostinato until it's, terrifying, or sit on a triad and see what happens,
And he also used very not very typical ensembles as well. I mean, he's not
absolutely. What I didn't know about him was he was and not to get into a whole long conversation about Bernard Herrmann, but
it's right. Yeah,
he studied with the music director for a radio network in New York called CBS. I mean, there's still CBS television. So CBS started off as a radio station and then a radio network, and they had live classical music, they had pre-recorded classical music, but the big thing they were doing were radio dramas. Mm-hmm. And this is where Bernard Herrmann met Orson Welles and eventually, led to Citizen Kane. Really, Bernard Herrmann discovered Orson Welles, not the other way around, because Bernard Herrmann was already very successful. But he would have to score a 1-hour show in about 2 to 3 days, and he would only have a budget for maybe 8 or 10 musicians at the most. And he had to do something with that. And they're not very good recordings, but you can hear a lot of that music. And it's like, he had to rely only on cleverness and color and simplicity. He did the original The Day the Earth Stood Still from the early 50s.
Fantastic soundtrack.
And there's a very, very long scene of the spaceship landing. And it's supposed to really get you freaked out, this spaceship landing in this little town. And the music is very simple. It's just an A minor chord with an A flat in the bass. And that's it. It's just it's a simple triad with the quote unquote wrong note in the bass.
Yeah.
And he sits on it for like 5 minutes and very little else happens. And that's music school right there.
Yeah, and also one of the, I would say, the most iconic duos of Star Wars, the battle between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and Darth Maul. It's basically under one motive. That's the this is the whole duo of the Fates. Obviously, they're the choir and the melody, but most of it is just that ostinato.
Yeah, it's fabulous. It's fabulous. I will say I think it takes a certain bravery to be simple, because I don't know, for some reason we're expected to be clever, but not really.
In my personal experience, I would say that I have the tendency towards over orchestrating and putting a lot of stuff inside, mostly because I feel that otherwise my music will be too thin, but that's not right. There's no such thing as thin music. It's if it's performed right, if the music is right, then it can be simple, with just 2 instruments, like chamber music. But then you have to be very brave to, like, it's as if you're naked, otherwise if you add in a lot of instruments and layers on top, then it becomes easy to hide behind different elements.
I don't know if you've probably met him, I don't know, but like just before he died, maybe a month before he died, I had a long talk with John Aston Thomas. Did you ever meet John?
No.
John is, he's many things, but he was John Powell's orchestrator for most of John's career. So he's orchestrated for most of the major film composers. He just passed away a few months ago, late last year. And I talked to him just beforehand, and we were talking about this very thing. And I said, well, is it your approach to just keep the orchestra busy all the time, that everybody is either a foreground or a background player, and to get that lush, quote unquote cinematic sound, just keep no tacits, no rests.
Yes.
Just keep everybody doing something. And sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not. And he said, absolutely not. He said, there's no such thing as cinematic orchestration. You said you have your musical ideas, you keep them in focus, you keep the orchestra balanced, and that's all it is. It's just about balance. It's not about size or lush. And I've listened to a good amount of your music, and I've never heard a note out of place personally. I think you have these beautiful lush harmonies, and I admire that. And that's not complexity in my imagination, in my mind. I don't think of harmonic lushness as being a distraction. You know what's a distraction is when you have instruments coming in and out all the time, and a new color and a new color and a new color, and then it comes in. You know, kind of the whole idea of string quartet writing or chamber, like you brought up, chamber music writing, is about the instrumentalists are kind of having this conversation, and somebody says something and then somebody replies, and then somebody says, oh yeah, but what about this? And well, you know, let me take that down an octave. And you have this, and it's highly contrapuntal. And I think maybe it's the overuse of counterpoint that sometimes is when film music gets distracting. When you have too many things starting and stopping too frequently, that it distracts us from what's really valuable. Like with that Star Wars example, that it's an ostinato and this very simple melody, and it can go and go and go, and you have the energy of the ostinato and the darkness of the ostinato with the cinematic quality of a simple, basic melody, and I love that.
Yeah, well, if you look at it, it's a very simple example. Same thing goes with Howard Shore, for example, when Gandalf falls down in Moria, when they come out, it's just one solo voice and a very, very simple harmony, which is very, very opposed to what you would normally hear. Yeah, maybe you would hear some like string writing, something like Barber's Adagio or something, I don't know. But here you have something that's way effective and still has less notes than anything else.
Yeah.
And how
well,
did
you and I agree with this?
Yeah. How did you learn this? Was it by experience, by trial and error, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like a lot of less experienced composers getting started, they feel pressure to be clever and smart and sophisticated. And look, there is a place for cleverness, there is a place for intelligence, and there is a place for sophistication. But you know, I think what I noticed was I was writing music in my early career, where I kept wondering why it was when I got to the dub stage, they kept turning the music down. and then there'd be source music, and the source music would be really loud. And it was like, that, what's going on here? and it kept happening. And I have to be honest, it probably happened to me for a couple of years before I started really wondering, well, what is it about my music that makes them want to turn it down? And nobody would just come out and say, well, you know, Jeff, you're just writing too much. There's just too much information for a human being to process while they're listening to the dialogue. And trust me, when a director is on a dub stage mixing music and dialogue, there's only one winner in that.
That's right. Yeah.
And correct, it is correct. The composer's job is to enhance the characters, the plot, and the dialogue. And we are in service of that, but with a high level of creativity. I feel, honestly, I had to start asking myself this question, this difficult question of what's wrong with the music. I mean, I don't get fired, but my music isn't what I hear in my mind. And I think part of it was meeting a few people along the way who really listened to my music and said, you know, Jeff, this is just too much. And I was very lucky in that way. And, you know, Hans Zimmer was a great example, you know, having a studio with him and Harry Gregson Williams and John Powell and a host of other, you know, Ramin and Jawadi. And I mean, what a great group of people. That was my filter for almost 10 years. And often it was like, why did you do this? Why are you doing this and that? And Harry's a great example of somebody who knows how to be in the front, and then he knows how to step back. I think people don't credit Hans with kind of the same thing. I mean, he's well known for these great themes and the sophistication, but At the same time, he understands simplicity. And then I ended up having a very long, he's still one of my dearest friends, is Cliff Martinez.
Oh.
And Cliff is
Solaris is one of my favorite soundtracks. Solaris.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, Solaris is a great example of taking complex modern classical music like Lutoslawski and Penderecki and turning it into something completely unique, which was stripping down the structural complexity of it into just texture. So you can have a complicated texture, but at the end, that's just I think of that as a note. So Cliff will spend more time erasing music than adding it. And, you know, sometimes he even struggles to have stems to his music because there's only one instrument.
Yeah.
For an entire scene. And he takes it to this almost ridiculous place, whether it's electronic or orchestral. And in fact, I think he just scored a new Soderbergh movie on HBO called Kimmy. And the movie is a little bit in an homage to Hitchcock and Rear Window and The Conversation. And so, you know, it's a listening in on the spying thing. And the score is very much an ode, a tribute to Bernard Herrmann's use of just these swelling chords that just swell in and out of silence. And that's it. And again, it comes back to that same idea of avoiding complexity that will create distractions. So yeah, I think I just had it hammered into me, and not just by other composers, but directors too, who would say, Jeff, it's just too much.
Yeah.
And it's embarrassing when that happens, and it's humbling to realize when you've kind of not stopped to think about it, and especially when it's too much and not enough. I mean, it's one thing if somebody said, you know, Jeff, your music just isn't supporting the scene enough. I need more. I need bigger. I need, you know, well, of course, we're very used to the darker, please, you know, make it darker.
Make it darker, yes.
You know, you can have that, like on video games, they can just sort of tattoo that on the inside of your eyelids, you know, make it darker. and so I guess because I've really embraced an evolution in my music of trying to say the most with the least, it gets back to your question about what about deadlines? Well, as you get better at it, and it takes practice, you start to realize that having a sense of simplicity and directness and intent is super important. But I think there's another aspect to deadlines. So, you know, at the beginning of a project, you have approximately so many weeks. So do you sit down and just write M1? You know, do you write the opening of the movie? No. If you do that, you're screwing yourself. It's not about writing the cues. It's about writing the themes and the gestures and the motifs and the core of it. So the way I do it, and the way many people do it, is before you turn on the picture, before you sit down to score, to picture, or anything like that, you create a book of ideas, and you refine them, and you can spend a lot of time. This is when, if you're doing electronic music, you might do some sound design work and spend time sampling, spend time programming, maybe hire a sound designer to help you come up with some cool, weird stuff if it's not your forte. But to write and write and write and experiment. This is your sandbox. This is the place to play. There's no pressure. None of it's to picture. What I like to do is come up with a dozen ideas that I think are the voice of the score. And then go to the director or producer and say, let me play you some ideas. It's often one suite. So it actually has transitions and it feels kind of musical and it's kind of enjoyable to listen to. But it's usually well under 5 minutes because each idea is fairly brief. And I'll play it for them, and while I play it for them, I watch their face. And I know they don't have to open their mouths once. I know which tracks or ideas are yes and which ones are no. Immediately, just by watching their eyes. And by the end of that experience of spending time building the palette, building the sonic world of the score, coming up with some melodic ideas, some rhythmic ideas, some thematic ideas, whatever that is. Then when it's time to actually sit down, so maybe that takes up a week or two. So now there isn't that much time because you have to get ready to orchestrate and, you know, record and stems and blah, 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 all the technical stuff that takes time. Now you can work really fast because now you can lift an idea out of your notebook, drop it in a scene, and then start to rework it. Let's replace the oboe with the piano. Let's slow it down. Let's add an ostinato. Let's take the ostinato out. Let's change it from major to minor. But it's there. It's already there. It's actually on your screen. It's on your computer, and it opens you up to adding something that's incredibly important in the score, which is adding some consistency.
Yeah.
A temp score, every scene may have an incredible piece of music in the temp,
Yeah.
but nothing ties the score together, right? It's just idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, idea 4. You know, sometimes if they're clever, they'll repeat things, but often it's just a pastiche that doesn't define the music. One of the great things about hiring a composer is that you have a singular vision, and you can have a theme that can introduce itself in a dark way, in a light way, in a scary way, in a loving way. And frankly, if you do your sort of preparation work, you know, like the sous chef in the kitchen, they've chopped the onions, they've crushed the garlic, you know, they've chopped the parsley, they've done everything is sitting ready. All the chef has to do is throw them in the pan, turn up the heat, and put it on a plate. It's all, the hard work gets done before you've written the first note. And that's, I think, the right way to score.
I have even though I rarely have the time to actually do like a suite out of it. I have this is obviously, the podcast is audio only, but you can see.
Well, you're holding up a music notebook of blank score paper and furious notes scribbled all over the place.
Yeah, because then it actually becomes very easy when you have the thematic material and the instrumentation, and it can even be just like a synth sound, like a sound design, something that you associate a character or an event with this, and it becomes so much easier when you have to work under a stressful deadline. And this is something that it's kind of, I would say, common for everybody who worked at remote control back then, Media Ventures, correct?
I don't know. I think so. I think it was, I would say for most of us, it just seemed like a better way to do things. One of my mentors was Basil Polidorus.
Oh.
And
wonderful.
So I was his synth programmer on a few projects, and I was also his orchestrator on a few things. I was sort of like assisting his orchestrator, you know, staying up all night to get orchestrations for some of his projects. And, you know, he was first and foremost a brilliant pianist. And he had the ability, I mean, he had a full MIDI rig. He wasn't very good with it. He actually had an assistant. He would write on paper, and he had an assistant enter the MIDI into his rig, because he did not like the feeling of sequencing. He didn't like that.
Yeah.
And so everything was paper. But Basil had this ability to have a director come over. And because he was studying to be a concert pianist, he could actually sit down and literally talk us through a score, talk through a scene. He'd hit play on the video, and he would play on a piano in front of the director, and he would narrate. He would say, and then French horns are going to come in, and then the cellos are going to do this, and then there'll be timpani. And he's playing and talking, and it's perfectly in sync to the scene. And his playing is so good that you're just like, at the end of it, your mouth is just open going, what just happened?
Yeah.
That it was such an he was so fantastically musical. Truly, truly magnificent.
I would say that
I can't do that. What I was trying to get at is I can't do that.
Yeah. I love Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the and
I
it's
worked on that.
really. Did you?
Actually, no, I did the second one,
Ah, the
Conan the
second one.
Destroyer.
Okay, the Destroyer. All right. Well, that's an amazing score as well. But the remarkable thing, and that's even not about the music. It's about the interpretation and the sound to it. So I think it was recorded in Rome, I believe, the first one, and it's. I wouldn't say it's a very good recording. I mean, the orchestra, they don't play very much together, but it has a very specific sound. And they did a re-recording of that a few years back in Prague, I think. And it's just too perfect for me. And I'm listening. That's not Conan. That's Conan
Wow.
the I don't know, the king, or Conan the prince, not the barbarian. So that's also about
That's
creating
funny.
a sound that's interesting. And I see behind you there's your signature. Obviously, there are the synths, but also the ethnic, a plethora of ethnic instruments.
Yeah. All my hundreds of wind instruments, and you can't see it. I have other instruments around, and I have a gamelan upstairs.
Amazing.
And that's it's like an erhu, but it's actually from Southeast Asia. It's from Laos. But similar idea. The two strings and the bow goes in between them, so you can't take the bow off the instrument. It's actually under the string, not over the string.
And you play on those, because I know that you've also performed on a lot of scores, in a way.
Yeah.
Did you?
I used to do it all the time. I was just thinking about the fact that I used to play wind instruments on almost all of my scores, and then I would process them electronically and do kind of cool, weird things to make them very haunting and otherworldly. And then I don't know. I think I got a little fed up with all of the use of world instruments for no reason other than kind of they became trendy, and everybody had to have an erhu, had to have a duduk on their score, or it became so cliche. I got a little turned off, and I just stopped, and I'm literally probably doing it for the first time later today. I'm doing a score for a big video game. I've just started. I'm literally just writing the first sketch, and they wanted this modern meets ancient idea, and they had a couple of ideas about ancient music that kind of made sense. I mean, I did a video game. Well, now it's like almost like 9 years ago, God of War, which was all brutal, make it darker. We only have one note, Jeff, make it darker. And for that, I played my instruments on everything, and brought in other virtuoso players on Persian instruments and what have you. So again, it's just I've been exposed to so much of that music, not just from my teachers, but just over the years, having a love of music from all cultures, and everybody has something to teach.
Yeah, and that's very important for a film composer, and for a composer nowadays. To be able to understand, because nowadays it's not just about the orchestra or the piano or the harpsichord, how it was like years before that. Nowadays we can blend different cultures, and we have to learn from a lot of ethnic music. I don't like the term ethnic music, because it's just music.
I don't either.
Yeah,
it's music. We say world music just to mean world. You bring up a really interesting point. So you went to university to study music?
That's right.
Yeah, so did I, although like I said at the beginning, it didn't, we were not meant to be. But when you think about music theory and composition as a part of music theory, what is music theory at universities? It's the study of a handful of composers from Vienna mostly, and the scales and chords and harmony that they chose. And that's the standard. That's it. You know, I was watching, there's a podcast that I watch by he's actually a jazz bass player named Adam Neely. And
Yeah,
he gave a
I know
whole,
him.
he did a beautiful, about less than a year ago, he gave a beautiful podcast, or it's a YouTube video on the relationship of music education and white supremacy, which is, you know, we all study Palestrina, but we never study Ravi Shankar.
Yeah.
And it's a good point. It's very true that classical music is a very, very, very narrow perspective of music. Even if you include, you know, the avant-garde of the 20th and now 21st century, although avant-garde music in the 21st century is very different now because it's gotten beautiful again, and simple,
minimalistic, yeah, you know,
and very, very, very subtle.
Yeah.
Very subtle. But you know what I was taught in school was to be theoretical, to be complicated, to be aleatoric, to be non-tonal, and study the music of a handful of musicians from several hundred years ago, and strictly the path of European music and no other influences. But you know, Steve Reich was one of my greatest heroes. He got the inspiration for his music from Africa, and the rhythms of his pieces played by Western instruments, but based entirely on African polyrhythms. You know, Philip Glass credits studying with Ravi Shankar. You know, well, they both studied from Nadia Boulanger, but he was very moved by Indian music and the scales and more the harmonies than anything. Yeah. So, I mean, there's plenty of evidence to say that there is inspiration outside of that incredibly narrow perspective. And film, you know, the music of cinema has been a great melting pot of ideas, like bringing a duduk, you know, into a helicopter chase, and making it, it is kind of a melting pot, isn't it, of cultural influences. And I think maybe one of film music's great contributions to culture is the fact that we hear sounds and instruments and the actual musicians who come in and perform on a quote unquote Hollywood score and show what it means to be a great performer of an instrument that has a very specific cultural heritage. So far more so in music for cinema than music for the concert stage. And I think that's actually something to be proud of, even if it's gotten a little cliche in certain ways. You know, we can continue to invent ideas that come from as many heritages as possible and continue to ingrain them into the fabric of creating music that is just to tell a story.
Yeah. And what else gives us cinema, I would say, is the, you know, obviously there are examples that oppose what I'm going to say, but the cinema gives us the ability to experiment and to create stuff that's unusual. Obviously nowadays you have all the Marvel films and everything that's very straightforward in what they're doing, but from time to time you get stuff like, okay, I'll go back to Cliff Martinez with The Nick. Have you seen The Nick, this TV show?
I've listened to it. I watched a couple of episodes. It was kind of gross.
Yeah.
It kind of turned my stomach a little bit, which was actually what it was supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I certainly know the music very well.
Yeah. Well, so basically it's a period drama TV show with music that's like Tangerine Dream or something, you know, a very synth-based score, which is something that it's purely artistic driven. And
it's true. You know, you bring up a really good point. I remember, God, it's 20 years ago now. When did you remember there was a movie called Shakespeare in Love?
Yes, of course.
With Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yep.
And Joseph Fiennes. And it was a period drama or a period drama comedy, but the music was very modern. And it brings up an interesting idea about the relationship of music and storytelling, which is relatability.
Yeah.
The ability to connect an audience to a character and a story. And sometimes I feel that sometimes requires some thoughtfulness. So, for example, a movie that takes place in Elizabethan England about Shakespeare, if it had been scored with the actual music of that period, it would have been horrible.
That's
right. These crumb horns and these horrible noises and this really it would have been historically correct, but it would have been a dramatic, nightmare. And, look, one of the first, I guess it was the first animated film with DreamWorks was The Prince of Egypt.
Yeah.
And the story of Moses. And
you worked on this. Yeah.
I worked on it a lot. Mm. And, well, I was in charge of all the world music elements, which were formidable. But what was important was that film, although it drew from what were considered Middle Eastern influences, which, does anybody know what the music of Egypt 3000 BC was? No, nobody knows. There's hieroglyphs of some of the instruments, but nothing about the music itself. But the point wasn't to be authentic. And DreamWorks, I remember they hired an ethnomusicologist who wrote up a long paper on the music of ancient Egypt. And again, how much of it was conjecture? Well, about 100%. But at one point, the director of the film, the producer, Jeffrey Katzenberg, said, "We're not making a documentary here." And I remember this ethnomusicologist called me and begged me. He begged me to ask, because he'd heard some of the sketches. And he begged me to reconsider what we were doing, because to him, it was sort of offensive, to just do a Hollywood score for a movie about an Egyptian pharaoh and, the rest of it. So we incorporated colors, and we brought in an amazing Middle Eastern, actually, woodwind player, Shahad Rassi, who teaches world music at UCLA at the time. And he was brilliant. And in the end, we replaced about half of it with less authentic instruments. In fact, a lot of them played by me, to find kind of a halfway point between an authenticity and the fact that it had these beautiful themes that had nothing to do with Egypt or Middle Eastern music. A little bit did, but again, in cinema, it's exactly what you say. We have all of these tools at our disposal, including instruments from every heritage around the world, and we can use them to do what we want to do, which is to connect an audience with a story and a set of characters for a period of time. And whatever does that is fine. Does that mean we can be insensitive? Absolutely. We can write music about characters set in certain parts of the world, and the music can be inauthentic and be a bit, dismissive to a culture. But I think that's a conversation between the people who wrote it and directed it, the people who made the film, and the person or people who do the music for it.
Sure.
A.R. Rahman is a great composer. He's also a great Indian composer. And of course, he's the voice of modern Indian cinema, but he's also just a great composer. And he doesn't need to use Indian instruments or harmonies or melodies to get his point across, and has done scores where he doesn't. But he was steeped in the culture, and that's a good thing. If you're not steeped in the culture, it's always good to make allies with people who can sort of inform you. And then you can say, yes, we're going to go with ancient Egypt, or no, we're going to go with a beautiful melody that's going to bring, tears to your eyes, and it will have within it, hopefully, some awareness of that. I did a score, Lisa Gerard and I did a score for the Smithsonian Museum of Native American Culture, and they had looked into hiring a Native American composer, and at the end they felt that it was better for a Western composer to collaborate with the Smithsonian's ethnomusicology department, which is Folkway Records, the biggest archive of world music in the world.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And we got some shit for that.
Yeah.
But again, it was about finding a bridge between a non-Western story and a predominantly Western audience, and wanting to find a bridge. And sometimes that involves a collaboration of people and ideas.
Yeah.
So that's my feeling on that.
Do you know the soundtrack to, there was a Chinese movie called Hero with Jet Li?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and the score is Tan Dun. That's a very interesting, I would say, combination between Western and like Western musical tradition, which is quite simple if you think about it, you know, in terms of orchestration and obviously the Eastern way of it. But this balance kind of is made in such a way that it could please both Westerners when they watch it, and I suppose people also.
Yeah.
In the East.
Yeah, well, Tan Dun is is an incredibly accomplished musician who finds that balance. So he's a great example. And before him, there was another Chinese composer who did Raise the Red Lantern and Farewell My Concubine, and I'm blanking on his name. I met him once. We had drinks in a hotel lobby in a little town in China some years ago. I was working on the Beijing Olympics in 2008, and he came, and he was just sitting at the foot of the master. He was the Marconi of Chinese cinema, and I'm embarrassed. Please add his name in the liner notes of the podcast.
Yeah. We'll do. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess since film and TV and games are now global, video games, now that I'm doing so many of these, they're translated into 10, 12 languages.
Yeah.
When you play a game, you can be playing it almost any major language on the planet. You can play the game in that language, but the music's always the same.
Yeah.
It's a testament to the kind of the global world that we write for. Netflix, of course, makes films all over the world, but they actually have a Netflix office in India that produces films primarily for the Indian market. And that's true all over the world. They have local studios making original content that are primarily, but everything ends up on Netflix. And again, it's this global thing. So, I'm a kid from LA who studied music here. I think I was lucky to study from some weirdos like Milcha Leviev and others, and try to expand my view. But I think I was raised on Western culture and pop music and classical music, and that's still kind of in the center of what informs me as a writer.
And speaking of global, I'm really sorry that I had to, but the conversation was so interesting, so I didn't want to speak about this.
We got a little off the mark. I apologize.
No worries. So, but speaking about global, you also were part of something that made making music a more approachable thing for everybody, for me including. So you were part of the initial MIDI creation, that is the MIDI protocol, and that's a pretty global thing, I would say, even more global than Netflix. Yeah, because nowadays everybody uses, MIDI.
I had dropped out of school. I needed money. I had learned just a little tiny bit of how to write code, but I was a musician, and I had an accidental meeting with somebody at Roland, which has an office in Los Angeles. And I said, I went up to this guy at a music store, and I said, "Oh, I've programmed a computer to improvise music on a Roland synthesizer." And he just stares at me. He goes, "You need to meet my boss now." And the next day I met the president of Roland, and he hired me, not for MIDI, but for something completely unrelated, but computer oriented. And about 3 months later, and again, I'm just getting my bearings, and I'm not that good at it, and I'm struggling, but I'm making some progress on some things with Roland, and I'm getting along really well with the engineers. And literally one day, these two guys show up at my office, which was about a little bigger than a closet, and they bring 2 electric pianos. And there's a plug on the back of the piano, this 5-pin plug. And they said, Jeff, we've talked it over. We need you to stop what you're doing, and we need you to focus on something that we're working on. It's an experiment. And so it was the first MIDI keyboard in the United States. And immediately I was pushed into this world where the conversation had started about a year before me. And multiple ideas were discussed, but they had sort of already decided that this was kind of going to be it. And then there was again, at a NAMM show, there was a secret meeting, and I was there to represent Roland, but I'm sitting in a room with with Bob Moog and Tom Oberheim and Roger Lynn, awesome. and Mr. Kakahashi, the head of Roland, and it was all the chief engineers from everywhere. And I'm just like, what am I doing here? And they said, look, we know that this MIDI thing is something we're all interested in. We don't know what's going to happen with it, but we need to kind of organize ourselves. Who here wants to organize MIDI? It wasn't even called MIDI at the time. It was just called the protocol. And I was, I was 27. I had nothing. I didn't really have that much to do. I was single. It was perfect. So I raised my hand, and I'll never forget. It was Tom Oberheim who ran the meeting. I said, well, Tom, I'll do it. He goes, great. Who the are you? But then what I did was I created a way for everybody, all these competitors, to share a vision and share information. And I was the organizer. And along the way, I made certain decisions to help guide the process. So the technology was about 75% in place, but what to do with it was at 0. So I spent the next we released MIDI less than 2 years later, but those 2 years were a whirlwind of communication. And I figured out how to get everybody pointed in the same direction. That's, I think, what I did. And guys like Dave Smith and a host of people, and primarily in Japan, they were taking it very seriously. And they relied on me to keep all the oars in the water, so to speak,
sure,
and moving in one direction. And it wasn't the case when I got there, but within a year, I'd come up with a way of getting everybody pointed in the same direction, communicating with the same language. I wrote the MIDI spec from piles of notes. So MIDI 1.0 is a document that I created with a couple other people that had mistakes in it, and just I cleaned it up, I refined it, I asked a lot of questions, I corrected, I clarified everything, and then I did it for like 7 years. Once it was released, it was by no means done, and some of the most important things came later. All the synchronization, and the fact is that every iPhone, every mobile phone has a MIDI driver in it.
Yeah.
Every computer operating system has a MIDI driver in it. There are billions and billions of MIDI devices on the planet right now.
Well, let me just show you. So you're here. I'm just using my camera to show you like 4 synthesizers in Sofia, Bulgaria, in one of the weird neighborhoods that our studio is based in. And here we have a bunch of MIDI devices that it wouldn't have been possible to connect without your approach.
The original idea was that MIDI was kind of for big professionals. It was for Herbie Hancock and Keith Emerson and the guys who needed to have 20 keyboards on stage and maybe another 10 off stage. The initial idea wasn't that this was going to democratize music globally, but it did, yeah, and it created some sort of a revolution. There is, most of the music that we hear wouldn't have existed without it, and so it's a pretty profound shift for music production, because it costs, especially now that there's no more old cables, it costs 0. You can produce a hit song on a phone, and it's all based on MIDI. You can produce a hit song with strangers.
Yeah.
And sending files back and forth. And it's I can't think of an equivalent other than maybe QuickTime for video, maybe ASCII for keyboards, maybe USB has had a pretty substantial effect on the world,
but still not as much, I would say. Not as big as an impact as this one.
Maybe.
Yeah, and
not for me to say.
Yeah, I'm absolutely honored that we're speaking about this, because you kind of downplay it a bit, because when you speak about your involvement, but I'm sure that all those big names, Dave Smith, Oberheim, Bob Moog, whoever, they needed someone to unite them into a single vision. And in this case, and I don't think there is also such an event that happened in other businesses. I've never seen, I don't know, McDonald's and KFC coming together with a burger that's like
that would be horrible. That would be the end of civilization.
Yeah.
I'm vegan, so you know.
But again, you have all those competitors and those companies who at the time produced basically the same thing and were in direct competition, trying to work into a single thing that, whatever the reason was, nowadays people like me could actually start their own sampling company and hook different samples to CC1, CC2, and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is, you would think that the reason to do anything in life is money. I mean, these companies need to earn a profit. Was MIDI viewed as a way to generate a massive amount of money? Never. When we were doing it, we just thought, we're sort of making this transition from analog to digital. And as things get digital, the ability to connect things increases. And, at one level, it's like, well, wouldn't it be nice if somebody owned your drum machine, but my sequencer? And, but it wasn't viewed as what it became. So, I mean, I'd like to say that there was kind of a purity to it, that it wasn't just about, let's sit down and talk about how to generate 50% increase of revenue this year. It's just, it wasn't. We were a bunch of engineers and company, industry leaders. And the first thing that happened was companies came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Little tiny companies started generating something, software. Nobody was thinking about, companies that only made software. And yet suddenly there were sequencers from unknown companies. Yeah. And then smaller instruments from unknown companies, and then big instruments. And then it's just gotten, and now we have, the beginnings of MIDI 2, which brings up a whole layer of refinement. And a lot of it is geared towards orchestral writing. One of its main, it really has two primary goals. One is more nuance to the music itself with higher resolution. And the other one is to simplify the use of orchestral samples, where you don't have to think, well, if I switch libraries, will my key switches stop working and now a trill turns into a pizzicato and blah, blah, blah. It's going to be, it'll take a little bit of time, but there's, I know the major players are very hard at work to implement. I think just even this year, we'll start to see a little bit of what could be improved and simplified because of it.
Yeah, and also the MPE controllers, right?
Well, this is taking MPE to a whole new level.
Yeah.
MPE was like a sort of a short-term solution to adding more nuance and resolution to electronic music with samples and synths. But this takes that same concept and moves it just kilometers down the road.
That's amazing. That actually will bring up a synth very closely to an acoustic instrument. Yeah, the way it kind of behaves under your fingers.
Really? Maybe.
Just as a last question, tell me, what would be the first thing that you would do if you would start over now, today, from your perspective?
I would say learn to be a great music producer and think of producing as being as important as composing. I think I got into that slowly, but I had people who pushed me very hard to learn to be a great record producer as part of the process. The other one is to find your people and find your team, orchestration, engineering, conducting, booking orchestras, finding programmers if you're not great at the technology. There's no excuses. And the way everybody who has succeeded has been by having allies who are better at what they do than you are at what you do. Sure. So starting off, it would be, you're never too small to have the people underneath you or beside you, really, to say, you know, I know how to make this sound good, how to mix this, how to stem this, how to orchestrate this, how to make it sound professional while you yourself improve as a composer.
Yeah.
Because your music can be simple. You can be starting off. Look, everybody writes their first score and everybody writes their second score, but they shouldn't sound like it.
Yeah.
And then I think surround yourself with creative colleagues that you can bounce ideas off of, and don't try to be isolated. In an internet connected world, it's not an issue anymore. If you want somebody to listen to your music, you can put it up on a SoundCloud and go, what's this? Or post a quick time of a scene, you know, privately.
Yeah.
and say, what did I do wrong here? Be open to criticism, be open to suggestions, be open to doing it a different way. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? Ask yourself, just have a dialogue about, just remember, it's not the notes. Nobody hires you to write notes. They hire you to write emotions and create emotions and deliver a mixed and mastered recording of that.
Those
that
emotions
synchronizes to picture. And when you remember that, then the notes kind of, well, I don't want to say they write themselves, I wish. But you really do. For me, that's what I would focus on. I did then, to some extent. I would do it even more if I was starting over. And I would remember to never start by imitating another composer. You know, the world doesn't need more other composers. They need more you. And they're going to hire you for your perspective and your talent and your vision, and not your ability to sound like last year's Academy Award winner.
Awesome.
Sometimes that's not true. Of course,
sometimes.
You know, but nobody has ever gotten a career based on that skill.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much.
Maybe you get a few gigs.
Thank you so much for
George,
for this
so
conversation.
Good to see you.
All right. Stay safe.
Thank you, George. You as well.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.